Hi everyone! Today I painted some clouds using gouache. As promised, I am continuing the gouache study series, and today we're looking at the subject of clouds. So I chose some really fluffy clouds to study from, and I'm painting in my Etchalab sketchbook, and I'm using the Miyahime gouache again. All of these will be linked in the description. I have 2 jars of water, a tea towel, and some brushes. And to start off, I'm just doing a very quick and very light sketch, just sketching out all of the clouds. And you'll see in a minute when I start why I do this. It's so that I can paint around the clouds and preserve the white of the paper. I start by mixing the color of the sky first. So here I'm just picking up some of the Prussian blue and I'm lightening it with a lot of white. And to tone down my blue, I like to use some burnt umber that just mutes the blue a little so it's not as saturated. And then I can just block in the sky and I just transition it to a lighter blue, so I just keep adding white as I move down. So my general approach to painting clouds is I like to paint in the sky around the shape of the cloud, so that way I'm preserving the white of the paper for the highlights. So when I actually start painting the clouds, I usually start with the darker values first and I just use the white of the paper to my advantage. Here I'm just painting in a second layer for the sky because I noticed the first layer was a little bit sheer, and then I'm just adding some red into my mixture so it's more of a purple color, and I'm just blocking in the bottom part of the cloud. After that, I just mix up some more of the same color and I use that to start painting in the shadows. So we can see from the reference photo that the light source is coming from the right hand side. So it's illuminating the right side of the clouds, which means the left sides are in shadow. So with clouds, you really just want to carve out those contours and get really smooth transitions so it looks really natural. And as I said before, I like to start with the darkest values first and I kind of just go lighter and lighter until I build up to those highlights. I do have to admit that this study was particularly challenging for me and I almost gave up on it halfway, but luckily I persisted and I managed to get through it. But let's talk about the problems that I faced when I was painting this. First, I kind of had trouble identifying what color to lay down. From what I could see, it just looked kind of grayish purple, and then because of the sunlight hitting the clouds, it was kind of a warm orange pinkish glow. But for some reason I just couldn't quite pick out the colors, and so I was struggling with that. And secondly, I was struggling to get those smooth blends so the contours looked more natural. You can see in this stage that it kind of just looks like separate pieces. It almost doesn't look like the smooth transition that clouds should have. So those were the main 2 things that I kind of struggled with. But what I told myself to do and how I kept going was I just kept laying on the paint and I just kept kind of pushing the values. So I would look at my painting and just judge the value and see if it was dark enough, and the more I kind of pushed those darker values, the more contrast I managed to create, which brought the cloud more to life and just gave it a bit more depth. And so I just kept doing that, and then once I laid on those dark values or those darker shadows, then I would go in and just try to smooth them out and just transition it gradually into the highlights so that way they looked nice and smooth. So that was my process for this first study. I think I spent just under an hour on this one, and as always I found that with my studies I always spend the most amount of time on the first one because I'm still kind of finding my feet and finding the best way to approach the subject. For the second study, I'm mixing Prussian blue and ultramarine blue with some black to get those dark colors in the sky, and then I transition it to a lighter blue as I move across to the right hand side. And again, I'm just painting around the clouds so I can preserve the white of the paper for the highlights. For those bright rays shining out behind the clouds, I just mixed more white paint into the mixture to lighten it, and then I just painted in strokes that were coming out from behind the cloud. And then I also made sure to blend it out again with the darker paint. I just went back and forth between the lighter and darker paint and just blended it all out and just painted in strokes coming out from the direction of the clouds to imitate the sunlight rays shining out from behind the clouds. Now for the clouds, I mixed a bluish grey color. So I mixed ultramarine blue with burnt umber. So the burnt umber tones down the blue. So the more grey that I want it to be, the more burnt umber I mix in. The more blue that I want it to be, the less burnt umber that I mix. So that was basically the only colors that I used to paint in the cloud. And again, I'm starting with those darker values, and then I'm just making my way towards the highlights, getting lighter as I do, and I'm just carving out those contours in the clouds first with those darker colors and then building up to the highlights. This second study was more enjoyable than the first. I learnt from my mistakes in the first study. One of the reasons that I was struggling with getting those smooth blends in the first study is because I wasn't working fast enough and the paint was drying on the paper, so I couldn't get those smooth transitions, and that was partly due to the other issue I had where I was just uncertain about what color to lay in. So I spent too much time trying to get that right, so the paint was just drying on the paper. So in this second study I worked a little bit faster because I was more confident in the color, and I also made sure to load up my brush with more water and more paint, so that way when I laid the paint down on the paper it just gave me more time to work with it before it dried. So as I transitioned to a lighter color, the darker colors I'd laid down were still wet, so that way they would just blend together naturally, so I could easily achieve those smooth and natural looking contours. Then I also went in with pure white paint and just cleaned up the edges of the clouds, since when I painted in the sky I wasn't too careful to paint it perfectly because I knew later I could come back and fix up anything. So I just used the white paint to bring out those really bright highlights around the edges of the clouds. And then here I'm just again looking at my painting and just judging the values and seeing if there's anything I can push, if I can create more contrast in the clouds and just paint in a few more contours just to bring it more to life. For the third study, I again had trouble identifying what color to mix. So the color I think looked a little bit off to me, but I think I did manage to bring out the fluffiness of the cloud, so I was happy with that. And before I was just removing some of the paint with a tissue because I accidentally covered up too much of the clouds with the purple sky color, so I just quickly absorbed some up while it was still wet. And then for the actual clouds, I'm using the same approach of starting with the darker shadow color to just carve out all of the contours, and then I just work up to the highlights again. So that's kind of my process. For the final study, I really just followed the same approach again. So there isn't too much to explain in terms of what I did. In terms of the color, I just used, I think, ultramarine blue and Prussian blue, and I just tone it down with burnt umber, and I also mix in a little bit of red so that it's a bit more of a purpley color at times. And then some of the clouds are illuminated by the warm light of the sun, so I mixed in some of the warm yellow with some pink to create that warm yellow orangish glow. Today's study of gouache clouds was quite challenging for me, but then again, that's the whole purpose of these studies, to just experiment and learn new ways to approach a subject. So this was really good practice, and I encourage you guys to try these studies as well. You don't have to use the same reference photos I did, but if you want to, I'll have them linked down below. I hope I was able to explain clearly my process and approach to painting clouds, and hopefully you're able to take something away from this and also apply it to your own learnings and your own studies. I will definitely be continuing this series of studies, and I've already seen a lot of comments with suggestions about what I should do next, and I'm definitely keeping them all in mind. If you have any other suggestions, definitely just leave it in the comments and I'll add it to my list, since I have many studies that I want to do. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.